Lucky you.
36 best
Tune
holes in
into
golf.
Alternate Shots podcast,
Barney's Army.
where we talk about golf,
Sandy.
poker,
James Bond.
horse racing,
Double.
classic movies.
Zenyatta.
We have no script.
Down the stretch they come.
We are glad you joined us.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Well, Billy Regan, we're really lucky today. I would like to get started by thanking Cody Gifford for coming on. Welcome to the show. We really appreciate it and look forward to hearing your stories today.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having
Welcome
me.
aboard, Cody.
Driving down the Merritt Parkway with my dad in his blue Mercedes, and he had just got the Norah Jones CD, and he loved that Norah Jones CD, and I think he liked the fact that he knew how to work his CD player and that he could burn a disc or whatever it was. So we listened to that thing over and over and over again. So whenever I'm going down the Merritt or whenever I hear songs from that CD, I always think of my dad.
Let's talk about Frankie's grandfather. Come on. He was a stalwart just about everywhere he went. What can you tell Billy and me about you'll never forget about your dad?
Man, where to begin? It's funny. You mentioned well, so I'll start with Wellington. He was always well to dad, right? And it's so funny. You're gonna think I have like Harry Potter, one of those magical sacks where I just keep pulling stuff out of. I thought you guys would get a kick out of this, and I'll pull it up to the camera here in a second. But what I'm looking at is here. This is a letter on New York Football Giants letterhead dated from February 9th, 1961. And it's from Wellington. It was written to my father. And the reason I bring this up within the context, I know you both are golf fans and have Wingfoot has a special place in both your hearts. And obviously Wellington was my father's sponsor to Wingfoot. Now that meant I can't tell you what that meant to my dad, being a kid from Bakersfield, California, that he was being sponsored by the owner of the New York Football Giants into the hollow ground that is Wingfoot. And honestly, until the end of his life, he would always, whenever Wingfoot came up, he would always boast. I don't know if boast is the right word, but he would represent proudly that Wellington was his sponsor. It was always in the same sort of breath. I think I've told you that before, Bob. But anyway, the letter here says, "Dear Frank, I didn't get a chance to speak to you yesterday to tell you personally how much you have meant to me and to the Giants. You were with us at both ends of the rope, and no player ever did more to bring us from the bottom to the top. From the moment you joined us, I never knew you to be anything but the top. I never knew you to do anything in public or private that did other than reflect credit to yourself and to us. We have had and will have other fine boys and other great players, but I don't think there will be any who could so completely combine the epitome in both. We all wish you the best. You gave nothing less. You are nothing less, and you deserve nothing less. As always, well." And what's kind of neat about that is that was February 9, 1961, after my dad retired for the first time, right? He had the very famous hit by He Who Will Not Be Named, Bednarik. And everybody thought that was the end. And speaking of broadcasting, everybody, he was working for CBS, I think it was. At the time. He had a radio show concurrently while he was playing. And that was sort of, I guess, in some ways, sort of a paradigmatic thing where he was one of the early stars of whatever his sport was, whether it was football or baseball or what have you, transitioning into broadcasting. But I guess he had the itch, and he didn't want to give it up. And he obviously came back and played 3 more years after that, and was the first ever comeback player of the year. So I think the original question was a memory about dad. I mean, I was just a twinkle in his eye then, but it's kind of fun, especially being home here in Connecticut while we're still here, to go around. And I take very good care of my father's memorabilia, and I walk by and pat his we've got a replica of his bust in the Hall of Fame. We have got one around the corner here, and I got a million stories. So other than that, hopefully you guys get a kick out of that.
Well, I learned something about your dad at this Super Bowl, which I had heard from Frank a number of times. His early days, he called it the invocation at the Masters, and he did that very well. But your dad did the entire game because he was the on-field reporter. He did reporting each of the 4 quarters. I had never heard that before. How cool is that?
Oh, I mean, it's just kind of surreal to think about, right? You go back to, he would always say, a kid from Bakersfield. And it's sort of like a little bit of Forrest Gump-esque right? When you think about all these different arenas that he not only participated in, but had such great success in. And I say that, of course, just as a proud son. I'm immensely proud to be his son. But what's wild, Bob, I don't know if you know the story. So he had promised the network that he was going to get an interview with Vince Lombardi before the game. So he had, again, this is his big, he had just retired not all that long ago, right? Just a few years ago, maybe 5. The merger was what, 66? This game, right around then, maybe shortly thereafter. Again, I wasn't around, so don't. Someone's going to fact check me at some point, but we're talking mid to late 60s. And he was trying to make a name for himself now in broadcasting. And of course, he knew Vince because Vince had been the offensive coordinator for the Giants. Yeah. So he had special access that the other guys and gals in the media did not have access to, right? So in the pregame meeting, he said, okay, I've spoken to Vince. Vince is going to give me the interview, and we can count on it. Let's put it on the schedule. So Vince is coming out of the tunnel, and again, I've been hitting the head maybe too many times. It was the LA Memorial Coliseum. Vince is coming out of the tunnel, and Dad goes up to him, and he brings a microphone up, and Vince waves him off. And so, and Dad said, nah, and he chased after him. Dad was pretty quick, and Vince was kind of lumbering over. So he catches up to Vince, and then you mentioned there was actually another network that was covering the game. There were 2 different networks covering the game, right? So one of the other reporters, I forget who it was, bolted after because he saw what was happening. So I guess he only got the other reporter got just a fraction of what my dad caught with Vince. But my dad said Vince was as white as a ghost. He was so nervous for this game because I think even then, and a lot of who calls Vince Lombardi nervous, right? I mean, he's sort of the epitome of ice water. But Dad knew him in a different way, and I think Dad knew his ticks and had spent enough time with him. He called him a very, very dear friend. But I think Vince had, what's cool in that story, I think, is that Vince had the foresight to know what this game was going to mean for the NFL, right? And guys like Pete Rozelle and Vince and, all those guys back then, who are now still to this day on the Mount Rushmore of the NFL and sort of define the way we know and consume and recognize and love the NFL today. A lot of it was, you can kind of trace a straight line back to really the late 50s and the advent of television, and then the merger, and then the Super Bowl being presided over like guys like Rozelle. And my dad was fortunate to be along for the ride at a perfect time in history, right? First as a player, and then as a broadcaster, and then on 27 years of Monday night. So,
they talk about Arnold Palmer and what Tiger Woods has done to the game, but Tiger Woods, in a real honest moment, would say he came from a platform that Arnold Palmer built. And your father was beyond football. He was beyond, obviously, he was the top guy. He wasn't a great golfer, but he was one of the top guys at the Masters. He could get an interview, and he was also the Hollywood. He had so much charisma, just like Palmer had.
Better you saying it than me, Bob.
Well, you know what he would say about some of these announcers today. Bobby, they talk too much.
Yeah, they talk too much. I'll give, just as in a complete aside, you guys will get a kick out of this. As my dad got older and older, I have a very fond memory of my dad. I walked in and he was watching the news, really intently focused on whatever he was watching. But here's the kicker. The mute button had been activated. So he's watching the news and he's just locked in to whatever the hell's going on. And I kind of watched him there for a beat. And again, he's advanced age at that point. And I said, Dad, what are you doing? He said, I'm watching the news. I said, well, why do you have the mute button on? He goes, because I've heard it all before. All right, I'll be brief, I promise. No, you mentioned Arnold Palmer earlier when you were so very kindly being complimentary of Dad, being one of the people who kind of built up the game and the infrastructure in the NFL. And my wife and I guess then girlfriend, we were at a place called the Greenbrier in West Virginia. Beautiful, yeah, exactly. Beautiful old hotel and resort, and we're there for the wedding of a dear friend of my wife's, and we're getting in the elevator, and out walks Arnold Palmer and Lee Trevino.
Wow.
And they're walking down the hall, and I think, you know what? I've never met him. Bob, like you said, he's in his element here. He's here to relax. Everybody and their mother is going to go bother these guys. And then, but I told Erica, I just finished telling Erica because I think I had heard that he was at the hotel. And I had finished telling Erica, that my dad had called, of course, some of his matches. And she kind of elbowed me. She's like, you got to go introduce yourself. And that's, Bob, you know me, that's like the last thing, because people would do it to my parents. And I was very sensitive to that. And I said, you know what? The guy is, whether he's the GOAT or not, that's for debate for you guys to have another time. But I went over to him and I introduced myself and I said, excuse me, sir. It's a pleasure to meet, sirs, it's a pleasure to meet you both. I'm just in awe of what you guys have accomplished, and whatever I said, I probably sounded like an idiot like I do now. But I said, and they're both very, gentlemanly, of course, and very respectful, but they're kind of looking at me like, all right, here's just some other schmuck who's coming up to bother us when we're on our vacation on our way to dinner or whatever. And then I ended by saying, my father had the great fortune to call some of your matches. And it was Arnold who turned around and he said, oh yeah, what's your father's name? And I said, my father's Frank Gifford. And his eyes got really big. Same with Lee's. And Lee came over and gave me a hug. And I think it was either his son or his daughter who was just on their way to USC or is thinking about going to USC, University of Southern California. And they were just the coolest guys you could ever imagine. And Arnold Palmer, I'll never forget, he said, when you see your father, you please say that I said hello to him. And that's like, sounds silly, but the way it's Arnold Palmer, right? The way he said it and the way he looked, there was like a genuine degree of recognition and respect that this guy had for my dad and the reverence that I had for Arnold. Like it was by transitive property almost, like channeling through. I'm like, wow, this is really, really neat. And the fact that Lee had that connection to USC was super cool. So it's a silly story. It's kind of one where you had to almost experience it. But I told Erica afterwards, my wife, I said, it was so cool to see both of these guys have the kind of respect, the evident respect that they had for my dad. It just made me, it's hard not to feel warm and fuzzy when something like that happens. So
we got millions of Frank Gifford stories, and that's why you're coming back, along with, more importantly, this Johnny Roselli story. Well, when you see Erica after you part from us here, tell her thanks.
Nice nudge.
I'd be nothing if not for that elbow. I'm a sucker for that woman. She's my better half in the best of all ways. So, guys, it was such a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us
Casper,
today.
Billy Harmon.
We really appreciate your
Double
feedback.
Indemnity.
And please
Markey.
subscribe to the
Two
show
Outer.
and hit the
Claude
bell
Harmon.
icon so you get notified
Movie
of
Classics.
new episodes.
Mark Gable.
Hit them
Odd
hard
Job.
and hit them off.
Best 36 holes.